Before we begin, if you enjoy tales that lull you into a state of uneasy curiosity, stories where politeness might get you cursed, or where skeletons have unnervingly good manners, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more boring bedtime stories. Now, let us descend into the catacombs, where a single whispered greeting can unravel more than just silence. Chapter 1. The Whispered Greeting. The catacombs stretched endlessly before Elias Thornwood, a traveler who had, by some unfortunate miscalculation, mistaken a crumbling fissure in the hillside for a shortcut. The walls were lined with bones, not scattered, not haphazard, but arranged with a precision that suggested someone, at some point, had taken great care to ensure the dead looked their best. Skulls stared from alcoves, their hollow sockets following Elias's every step. Rib cages arched like cathedral buttresses, femurs stacked like firewood. It was, in its own way, almost artistic. Elias was not a superstitious man. He had laughed at village warnings about the catacombs being restless. He had scoffed at the old woman who pressed a charm into his palm, muttering about whispers that lingered in the dark. But now, as his lantern flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move just beyond his vision, he found himself gripping that very charm a little tighter. Then he saw it, a skeleton, propped against the wall as if taking a polite respite from eternity. Its posture was oddly casual, one arm draped over a bent knee, the other resting atop a pile of vertebrae. What struck Elias most was its expression, or rather, the absence of one. Yet somehow, the empty grin and tilted skull gave the impression of a gentleman waiting for a train, or perhaps a particularly interesting conversation. Against all better judgment, Elias leaned closer. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old stone, and his voice came out as a whisper. "Good evening," he said, because his mother had raised him to be polite, even to the dead. The skeleton's head turned. Not with a jerk, not with the clattering violence one might expect, but with a slow, deliberate tilt, as if it had been waiting for this moment for centuries. Its jaw creaked open and a sound emerged. Not a voice, not quite, but something like wind through a hollow pipe, forming words all the same. "Good evening," it replied. Elias froze. His breath caught in his throat, his fingers tightening around the lantern until the metal bit into his palm. The skeleton did not move again, but the air around it seemed to hum, a vibration that traveled up Elias's spine and settled at the base of his skull like a spider. "You speak," Elias managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The skeleton's fingers tapped against its knee, in a rhythm that might have been thoughtful, if skeletons could think. "Only when spoken to," it said. "And only in the tone I am given. You whispered, so I whisper. It's only polite." Elias swallowed. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "Disturbance implies interruption," the skeleton said. "I was doing nothing. I am, as you see, very good at doing nothing." A nervous laugh escaped Elias. "Right, well, I'll just be on my way then." The skeleton's head tilted again. "Will you?" Something in the way it said it made Elias pause. Not a threat, not a plea, but a simple question, one that carried the weight of centuries. The lantern flickered again, and for a moment, the shadows on the wall behind the skeleton seemed to shift, forming shapes that might have been other figures, other watchers. "Is there a reason I shouldn't?" Elias asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The skeleton sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "You whispered," it said, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. Because in the catacombs, where silence had reigned for lifetimes, a whisper was a fragile, dangerous thing. It traveled further than a shout. It lingered. And once given, it could not be taken back. Elias realized, too late, that the charm in his hand had grown warm. The old woman's warning echoed in his mind. "Edo, not speak to them. Not even a whisper." "What I hear?" The skeleton leaned forward, its bones clicking softly. "No," it said. "Let me tell you what happens next." And as the lantern light dimmed, Elias Thornwood understood, with a slow, creeping dread, that he had just made the first and last mistake of his journey. Some greetings, no matter how polite, should never be returned. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and somewhere in the dark, another whisper began. Chapter 2. The Bones Stir. Elias Thornwood had faced many peculiar situations in his travels. Bandits who demanded tolls in riddles, innkeepers who served soup with suspiciously familiar-tasting meat, even a soothsayer who accurately predicted he would, one day, regret wearing his second-best boot. But none of those experiences prepared him for the slow, deliberate creak of a skeleton's jaw opening in response to his own words. The skeleton's hollow gaze remained fixed on him, its empty eye socket somehow conveying a patience that only the dead could muster. Its fingers, previously resting on its knee, now lifted slightly as if preparing to gesture. The bones of its wrist rotated with a soft, grinding noise, like a rusted hinge protesting its use after centuries. "You're lost," the skeleton observed, its voice still that same eerie whisper, as though the words were being carried on a breeze from some distant, forgotten tomb. Elias swallowed. "I am." There was no point in denying it. The catacomb sprawled in every direction, and his lantern's light barely stretched far enough to reveal the next bend in the passage. The skeleton nodded, or rather its skull dipped forward slightly, the motion causing a faint cascade of dust to drift from its collarbone. "Lost is better than found," it said. "Down here, to be found is to be remembered, and to be remembered is complicated." Elias frowned. "Complicated how?" The skeleton did not answer immediately. Instead, it shifted, the bones of its legs unfolding as it pushed itself upright with a series of clicks and pops. It stood, not with the stiffness of a corpse propped up, but with the casual ease of someone who had simply been sitting for too long. Elias took an involuntary step back, his boot scuffing against the stone floor. "You see," the skeleton said, "when the living whisper to the dead, they give us back a piece of what we lost. A breath, a word, a name." It reached up, tapping one bony finger against its temple. Not much, but enough to stir. Elias glanced around, suddenly aware of how many other skeletons lined the walls. Were they always leaning so far forward? Had that one in the corner been missing an arm before? He couldn't be sure. The air felt heavier, as though the darkness itself was pressing in. "I didn't mean to wake you," Elias said carefully. The skeleton tilted its head. "Meanings are for the living. The dead only have consequences." It took a step forward, its foot bones clicking against the stone. "And now, you've given me enough to ask a question of my own." Elias's grip tightened on the lantern. "What question?" The skeleton's jaw creaked again, its grin widening impossibly. "Would you like to see what happens when the bones remember?" From somewhere deep in the catacombs, a sound echoed, a dry, rustling noise like 1,000 fingers drumming against stone. Elias turned his head just in time to see the nearest wall of bones shift. A femur rolled from its perch. A skull tilted to face him. A hand, missing 2 fingers, flexed as though testing muscles long since rotted away. The skeleton beside him sighed, a sound like sand slipping through an hourglass. "Ah," it said. "They're waking up." Elias Thornwood had never considered himself a coward, but in that moment he understood the profound wisdom of running very, very fast. Unfortunately, the catacombs had other ideas. The passage behind him, which had been clear moments ago, was now partially blocked by a cascade of femurs and vertebrae, as though the bones themselves had decided to rearrange the architecture. The skeleton clapped a bony hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry," it whispered. "They just want to say hello." And then, from every corner of the darkness, 100 hollow voices whispered back. Elias closed his eyes, just for a second, and wondered if his mother had ever considered that politeness might one day get him killed. Probably not. She'd been more concerned with table manners. When he opened his eyes again, the bones were still moving. Chapter 3. The First Rule of Catacombs. As the bones around him continued their slow, deliberate awakening, Elias Thornwood's mind flashed back to a moment he had, until this very second, considered utterly unimportant. It had been 3 days prior, in the dimly lit common room of Warty Guttering Wiki, a tavern whose ale was passable and whose advice was, supposedly, legendary. An old man, whose beard resembled a bundle of frayed rope soaked in soup, had leaned across the sticky table and fixed Elias with a milky-eyed stare. "You're heading for the catacombs," he'd said, as though accusing him of a crime. Elias, halfway through a tankard of something that tasted vaguely of fermented turnips, had shrugged. "If the weather holds, yes. There's a shortcut through the northern passage that shaves 2 days off the journey to—" "Don't." The old man's gnarled finger jabbed toward Elias's chest. "But if you do, remember the first rule." At the time, Elias had assumed this would be something practical, like "I bring extra torches," or "I don't lick the walls," though in retrospect that second one should have been obvious. Instead, the old man had leaned closer, his breath a potent mix of garlic and despair, and whispered, "No talking to the dead. Not a word, not a sigh. Not even a really polite cough to clear your throat if you accidentally make eye contact." Elias had laughed, partly because the idea was ridiculous, and partly because the old man's intensity suggested he'd once coughed politely at a skeleton and lived to regret it. "What happens if I do?" The old man's expression had darkened. "They answer." Back in the present, surrounded by increasingly animate skeletons, Elias was beginning to grasp the full implications of that warning. The one he'd whispered to, the one now standing beside him with an air of macabre hospitality, was bad enough. But now every skull in the chamber had turned in his direction. Every rib cage expanded slightly, as if testing the memory of breath. Every finger bone flexed. The skeleton beside him, whom Elias had mentally dubbed Ixir Creeksalota, let out a dry chuckle. "You're thinking very loudly," it observed. "Most of it is panic, but there's a thread of, regret. That's always my favorite part." Elias opened his mouth, then snapped it shut. No more words. No more mistakes. Sir Creeksalot tilted its head. "Wiser, but a little late." It gestured to the others, who were now detaching themselves from the walls with the sluggish determination of sleepers, roused too early. "They've heard you now, felt you, and they're right curious." One of the newly mobile skeletons, this one missing an arm and most of its teeth, lurched forward, its remaining hand outstretched. Elias recoiled, but the skeleton merely patted his arm in a grotesque parody of reassurance before shuffling past him to join the growing crowd. Another skeleton, this one with a crack running diagonally across its skull like a poorly mended teacup, approached and leaned in far too close. Elias held his breath as it examined him with empty sockets, then abruptly straightened and turned to Sir Creeksalot. A series of clicks and rattles passed between them, somehow managing to convey the cadence of a conversation without actual words. Sir Creeksalot nodded, then turned back to Elias. "It wants to know if you're here to replace the last one." Elias blinked. "The last, what?" "The last traveler," Sir Creeksalot clarified, as though this were perfectly normal. "The one who inkstedeng." A chill that had nothing to do with the catacomb's natural temperature crept down Elias's spine. He'd assumed the bones here were ancient, undisturbed for centuries. But the way Sir Creeksalot said it suggested something far more recent. Before he could stop himself, the question slipped out. "How long ago was that?" The moment the words left his mouth, Elias knew he'd made a mistake. The skeletons froze. Then, as one, their jaws dropped open in silent, rattling laughter. Sir Creaks-a-Lot placed a bony hand on his shoulder. "Now, Ty," it whispered, "is the right question." The sound of shifting bones intensified, and Elias realized with dawning horror that the skeletons weren't just moving, they were parting, clearing a path deeper into the catacombs. An invitation. And at the far end of the passage, something pale and broken-looking was stirring. Elias Thornwood, who had never particularly believed in rules, suddenly understood exactly why "I don't talk to the dead" had been rule number 1. Chapter 4. The Skeleton's Reply. The moment the distant figure stirred at the end of the passage, every instinct in Elias Thornwood's body screamed at him to run. But the catacombs had a way of swallowing such impulses whole. His legs refused to move, rooted not by fear alone, but by something far worse. Curiosity. Sir Creaks-a-Lot's fingers tightened on his shoulder, the bones pressing just shy of painful. "Ah," it whispered, the sound like dead leaves scraping stone. "He's noticed you." Elias swallowed hard. "Who is he?" Rather than answer, the skeleton beside him turned its skull toward the shifting figure and let out a series of clicks and rattles. A language of bones that needed no breath to carry it. The response came immediately, a dry, shuddering groan that echoed through the chamber, followed by the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across stone. The figure, now moving with jerky, deliberate motions, began making its way toward them. As it drew nearer, Elias realized with mounting horror that this skeleton was different from the others. Its bones were yellowed with age, cracked in places, held together in others by strands of something dark and fibrous that might once have been sinew. One of its arms ended abruptly at the elbow, the break jagged and uneven. But what truly set it apart was its posture, hunched, weary, as though the weight of centuries pressed down on its brittle frame. When it finally reached them, it stopped mere inches from Elias, its empty sockets studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then, with a creak that sounded like a ship's hull protesting a storm, it spoke. "You came back." The voice was little more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of years, decades perhaps, of silence. Elias opened his mouth to deny it, to say he'd never been here before. But the skeleton continued before he could speak, its jaw working with slow, grating precision. "No, wait, you're not him, but I smell like him." It leaned closer, the hollow where its nose had been flaring slightly. Same fear, same sweat, same terrible choice in boots. Elias glanced down at his second-best boots, the ones the soothsayer had warned him about, and felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. He choked it back just in time. The ancient skeleton straightened with a sound like a tree branch snapping under ice. "He tried to run, Last one. Got all the way to the surface before we had to drag him back." It tapped its temple with one skeletal finger. Took a while for him to understand the rules. Elias's mouth had gone dry. What rules? A ripple passed through the assembled skeletons, a rustling of bones that might have been amusement or impatience. The ancient one ignored them, focusing solely on Elias. "The first rule," it said, "is that you don't whisper to skeletons." A pause. "You already broke that one." "The second rule," Sir Creaks-a-Lot chimed in from beside him, "is that if you do whisper to skeletons, you don't ask questions." Elias felt the weight of his earlier mistake settle in his stomach like a stone. "And the third rule?" The ancient skeleton's jaw creaked open in what might have been a smile. "There is no third rule. We just like watching you people panic when we say, 'Third rule.'" The absurdity of it nearly made Elias laugh. Nearly. Then the ancient skeleton reached out, its remaining hand hovering just above Elias's chest. "But there is a consequence," it whispered. "For every word you give us, we take something in return." Elias' breath hitched. "What do you take?" The skeleton's fingers flexed, the bones clicking softly. "Nothing vital, just time." A murmur, approval, anticipation passed through the assembled dead. Sir Creaksalot leaned in, its whisper barely audible. "You've been very chatty." Elias had a sudden, vivid image of himself sitting against the catacomb wall, his flesh long since rotted away, his bones arranged in a polite waiting posture. The ancient skeleton's hand settled on his shoulder, its grip surprisingly gentle. "Don't worry," it said. "You'll get used to it." And then, with a sound like a door closing in a distant room, the lantern flickered and went out. In the darkness, Elias Thornwood realized three things in quick succession. First, he could still see, not with his eyes, but with something else, something that didn't rely on light. Second, the skeletons were no longer whispering. Third, and most horrifying of all, he finally understood what they'd meant by "I, the last one who stayed." Nin. As the darkness settled around him, warm and soft and strangely comforting, Elias opened his mouth to scream, but all that came out was a whisper. Chapter 5. The Curse of Politeness. In the suffocating darkness of the catacombs, Elias Thornwood's scream died as it left his lips, transforming midair into a dry, rustling whisper that sounded disturbingly familiar. He clapped his hands over his mouth, but the damage was done. Around him, the skeletons perked up with audible creaks of interest. The ancient skeleton, the one missing half an arm, leaned forward eagerly. "Ah, you've learned to whisper properly now," it observed with gruesome delight. "Took the last one 3 weeks to figure that out." He kept trying to shout. "Very rude." Sir Creaksalot nodded sagely, vertebrae grinding. "We don't tolerate shouting here, or sudden movements, or breathing too loudly after meals." Elias tried to speak, but found his voice had dwindled to the same papery whisper as the skeletons. "What's happening to me?" The skeletons exchanged glances, an impressive feat considering their lack of eyes. The ancient one cleared its throat, or at least made the sound one makes when clearing a throat one no longer possesses. "You've been cursed with the most terrible fate imaginable," it intoned solemnly. Elias braced himself. "You've become interesting company." A collective rattling of bones suggested this was some sort of punchline. Elias waited for the real horror to be revealed. When none came, he whispered, "That's it?" "Oh no," said Sir Creaksalot cheerfully. "The real curse is that now you have to listen to all our stories, all of them, in order." The ancient skeleton held up its remaining hand bones and began counting off fingers. "There's the time the roof collapsed in 1342, the great rat infestation of 1567, the 3 centuries we spent debating whether dust counts as a seasoning." As the skeleton droned on, Elias felt a dreadful understanding creep over him. The last one who stayed hadn't been killed or eaten. He'd been talked to death. Literally. The skeletons had formed a circle around him now, their bony fingers steepled in anticipation. "We haven't had a new audience in ages," confided one with a cracked pelvis. "The last fellow stopped screaming eventually. Then he stopped moving. Then he became much better company." Elias looked down at his own hands and saw with horror that they were becoming distinctly dry-looking. His skin had taken on a yellowish tinge, like old parchment. When he moved, his joints emitted a faint creaking sound. The ancient skeleton patted his arm reassuringly. "Don't worry. The first 5 centuries are the hardest. After that, you really start to appreciate the subtle differences between types of limestone." Sir Creaksalot leaned in. "Would you like to hear about the time a bat got stuck in the ribcage of Brother Hollowskull over there? It's a 12-hour story, but the payoff is worth it. The bat died eventually." As the skeletons launched into their tales with the enthusiasm of the chronically boring, Elias Thornwood made 2 solemn vows. First, he would escape this nightmare, even if it killed him, which, given the circumstances, seemed increasingly likely. Second, if he ever made it back to civilization, he would write the world's most emphatic travel guide, with "Don't talk to the dead" in letters so large they'd be visible from space. But for now, as the skeletons began a dramatic reenactment of the Great Cobweb Dispute of 892. All he could do was sit very still and pray to whatever gods might be listening that his ears would rot off first. The ancient skeleton, noticing his distress, paused mid-sentence. "Cheer up," it whispered conspiratorially. "In just a few hundred years, you'll get to tell your own stories to the next poor fool who says hello." Elias would have screamed again, but he was beginning to understand how pointless that would be. Instead, he did something far more terrifying. He got comfortable. Chapter 6. A History of Unfortunate Listeners. The ancient skeleton, now thoroughly warmed up from its cobweb anecdote, gestured grandly with its half-arm toward the catacomb walls. "Now that you're getting comfortable, let me introduce you to our previous guests," it whispered with dreadful enthusiasm. "Each one has a story. Literally, some have several. The boring ones only took decades to tell properly." Elias tried to protest, but his voice had dwindled to such a faint whisper that it barely stirred the dust at his feet. Sir Creak-a-Lot, noticing his distress, patted his knee with a bony hand. "Don't worry about speaking. Just listen. That's what they all learn eventually." The ancient skeleton shuffled to a nearby alcove, where a particularly yellowed skeleton sat propped against the wall, its skull tilted at an unnatural angle. "This was Brother Jorvik," it intoned solemnly. "Came down here in 1247, looking for lost monastery wine. Whispered, 'Bless you,' when I sneezed." Elias blinked. "Skeletons sneeze only when dust gets in our sinuses," Sir Creak-a-Lot explained. "Which is always." The ancient skeleton nodded. "Jorvik meant well. Lasted nearly 2 centuries before he finally stopped screaming. Made excellent progress on his story about medieval barrel-making techniques before his jaw fell off." It tapped the skeleton's tilted skull fondly. "We keep him around as a reminder to enunciate properly." Moving down the passage, the ancient skeleton pointed out other unfortunate additions to their collection with the pride of a museum curator. There was a 16th century tax collector who'd apologize for disturbing them. "Took 80 years to get through his treatise on turnip tariffs," sighed Sir Creak-a-Lot. The Victorian explorer who'd politely asked for directions never did finish explaining the principles of phrenology, poor chap. The Prohibition-era bootlegger who'd whispered "nice place you got here" while hiding from the law. His analysis of Chicago crime syndicates was actually quite engaging once we got him to stop sobbing. Elias's skin had taken on a distinctly parchment-like quality by the time they reached the most recent edition. A skeleton still wearing the tattered remains of what looked like a traveling merchant's coat. "Ah, yes," the ancient skeleton whispered fondly. "Alphonse. Only been with us 60 years. Still working through his family history. Gets emotional around the 3rd generation." Sir Creak-a-Lot leaned close to Elias. "We let him cry it out. Builds character." Elias looked at Alphonse's hollow sockets and the way his finger bones still clutched at the fabric of his coat. A terrible realization crept over him. This wasn't just a warning about what he might become. It was an inevitability. Already he could feel his joints stiffening, his skin drying, his very breath turning to whispers. The ancient skeleton mistook his silence for rapt attention. "Would you like to hear Alphonse's great-aunt's biscuit recipe? It's only 47 verses long with footnotes." As if on cue, Alphonse's jaw creaked open and a dry, papery voice began. "Upon the 3rd rising of the moon in harvest season, when the wheat has known the kiss of autumn dew, but not yet the bite of frost." Elias tried to stand, but found his legs no longer bent properly at the knees. The skeletons tactfully pretended not to notice as he awkwardly shuffled back into a sitting position. Sir Creak-a-Lot discreetly kicked his left foot back into alignment with a helpful crunch. The ancient skeleton sighed contentedly. "You're adapting wonderfully. Why, at this rate you'll be ready to start your own story in just a century or 2. It leaned closer, its nasal cavity almost touching Elias's ear. "Have you given any thought to what you'll talk about?" We do love a good genealogy. But if you've got any expertise in masonry techniques or medieval herbology. Alphonse droned on about sifting flour through virgin linen as Elias stared at his increasingly bony hands. Somewhere above them, the world continued. Seasons changed. Civilizations rose and fell. People lived lives that didn't revolve around the dramatic retelling of 14th century weather patterns. But down here, in the whispering dark, time meant something different. It stretched. It lingered. It gave you decades to perfect your telling of that one interesting thing that happened to your cousin's neighbor in 1723. As Alphonse reached the 17th stanza, about proper butter-churning temperatures, Elias did something unprecedented in the catacombs' long history of unfortunate listeners. He laughed. Not a hysterical laugh. Not a mad laugh. Just a dry, quiet chuckle that rustled like old leaves. The skeletons froze mid-sentence, their empty sockets fixed on him in something resembling shock. "You know," Elias whispered, his voice settling into its new papery tone, "if I'm going to be stuck here for eternity, I should probably start taking notes." He reached for a loose rib bone and a piece of stone. "Alphonse, from the beginning, please. And do go slowly on the biscuit measurements." The ancient skeleton's jaw dropped open in what might have been the first expression of genuine surprise it had made in 8 centuries. Then, with a creak that sounded suspiciously like joy, it settled down beside Elias. "Oh, this one's going to be special," it whispered to Sir Creaks-a-Lot. And as Alphonse began his recipe again with renewed enthusiasm, Elias did something truly terrifying. He made himself at home. Chapter 7. The Escape Attempt. Elias Thornwood's newfound enthusiasm for biscuit recipes had been, in hindsight, a tactical error. The skeletons had taken his sudden interest as a sign of proper socialization, and left him largely unattended, assuming he was too far gone to consider anything as radical as escape. They had, after all, centuries of experience, with reluctant listeners eventually embracing their fate. What they hadn't accounted for was the stubbornness of a man who could sit through Alphonse's entire lineage twice, while secretly testing how much mobility remained in his increasingly bony fingers. The opportunity came during a particularly riveting debate between Sir Creaks-a-Lot and the ancient skeleton about whether 14th century or 15th century mildew had better character development. As the argument reached its 73rd minute, Elias slowly, oh so slowly, began inching sideways along the wall. His joints protested with faint pops and crackles, but the sound was lost beneath the skeleton's enthusiastic bickering. He had nearly reached the edge of the chamber when his elbow brushed against a carefully stacked pile of femurs. The bones shifted with a clatter that sounded, to Elias's heightened nerves, like a cathedral bell ringing at midnight. Every skeleton in the chamber fell silent. Elias froze, his body halfway between standing and crouching in what he hoped looked like an enthusiastic listening posture. The ancient skeleton turned its head nearly 180 degrees to peer at him. "Going somewhere," it whispered. Elias' mind raced faster than his desiccated limbs could manage. "I was just stretching my legs," he offered weakly, his voice barely more than a breath. A ripple of knowing clicks passed through the assembled dead. Sir Creaks-a-Lot shook its head sadly. "They always try this part. It's tradition, really." The ancient skeleton gestured languidly toward the darkened corridors. "By all means, take a stroll. Just remember, the catacombs listen." Elias didn't need to be told twice. He shuffled forward with as much dignity as a man who was approximately 30% skeleton could muster, his footfalls disturbingly light on the stone floor. The moment he rounded the first bend in the passage, he broke into what might generously be called a jog, a stiff, creaking approximation of movement that sent dust cascading from his shoulders. Behind him, he heard no pursuit, only the faint, echoing whisper of the ancient skeleton calling after him, "We'll save your seat." The corridors twisted and branched in ways Elias was certain hadn't been there before. His lantern had long since expired, but to his growing horror he found he didn't need light anymore. The darkness had become as clear to him as daylight, every crack and fissure in the stone standing out in perfect detail. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a skeleton, leaning casually against the wall. This one was new, or at least newly animated. Its bones still bore traces of dirt and what looked like moss. It raised a hand in greeting. Elias sidestepped it with a mumbled apology. Old habits died harder than their owners apparently, and hurried on. But the damage was done. The moss-covered skeleton perked up at the sound of his voice, and began following at a leisurely pace. Worse still, its movements seemed to be waking others. From every alcove and side passage, skulls turned toward him. Bones stirred. A chorus of whispers rose up around him like a foul wind. Did he say something? I think he said something. Was it interesting? Nobody's interesting at first. Give him time. Elias picked up his pace, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps that no longer seemed to fill his lungs so much as rattle through them. The skeletons didn't chase him. That would have been too straightforward. They simply appeared wherever he turned, their whispers growing more numerous, more excited. A child-sized skeleton, missing both arms, blocked his path. "Are you lost?" it asked with terrifying innocence. Elias tried to push past, but the small skeleton dodged with unexpected agility. "You have to answer if someone asks you a direct question," it whispered. "It's polite." More skeletons appeared ahead, their hollow eyes gleaming with interest. Elias turned down a side passage, only to find it filled with skeletons sitting in neat rows, as though waiting for a performance to begin. One patted the stone floor beside it invitingly. Sir Creaksalot's voice echoed from somewhere close behind him. "They just want to get to know you, Elias. Isn't that what you wanted when you said hello?" Elias' foot caught on an uneven stone, sending him sprawling face first into a pile of bones that had been minding their own business until that moment. The pile shifted and resolved itself into 3 very annoyed-looking skeletons. "Rude," one muttered, brushing dust from its clavicle. "Extremely," agreed another, repositioning its tibia. The third simply stared at Elias with an expression of profound disappointment. "I was napping," it whispered. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to nap when you don't have eyelids?" Elias struggled to his feet, his body protesting with a symphony of cracks and pops. The catacombs had become a sea of bone around him, every skeleton within whispering distance now awake and attentive. The ancient skeleton pushed through the crowd, its half-arm raised in a placating gesture. Now, no need to overwhelm our guest." It turned to Elias, its empty socket somehow managing to convey sympathy. "You see the problem, don't you? Every whisper wakes another listener. Every step leads you deeper. Every attempt to leave. It spread its arms to encompass the watching dead. Just makes you more interesting." Elias looked at the expectant faces surrounding him. He thought of Alphonse and his endless biscuit recipe, of Brother Jorvik and his barrel-making techniques, of all the poor souls who had come before him, each adding another voice to the whispering dark. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Then, slowly, deliberately, he folded himself into a sitting position on the cold stone floor. "Well," he whispered, his voice already sounding more like theirs with every word, "if we're going to do this properly, someone should start taking minutes." The skeletons erupted into excited whispers. Sir Creaksalot clapped its hands together. "Oh, I like this one. Much better than the last fellow. He just screamed for the first decade." As the ancient skeleton settled down beside him with the satisfied air of a teacher whose pupil had finally learned the lesson, Elias allowed himself one last quiet sigh. Then he leaned forward and asked the most dangerous question of all. "So, where did we leave off?" The catacombs shook with the sound of 100 skeletal jaws dropping open in delight. Chapter 8. The Skeleton Symposium. The moment Elias asked his question, the catacombs erupted into a flurry of activity that would have been comical if it weren't so horrifying. Skeletons pushed and jostled for position, bones clattering like a hailstorm on a tin roof, as each dead soul sought prime storytelling real estate. The ancient skeleton raised its half arm for order, which was promptly ignored by everyone except a particularly conscientious ribcage in the back that always maintained perfect posture. Now then, the ancient skeleton began. Before we commence with this evening's symposium, we should establish some ground rules. A groan passed through the assembled dead. Not the rules again, muttered a pelvis wearing what appeared to be the fossilized remains of a belt. Last time we spent 3 months debating whether no interrupting includes coughing. Sir Creaks-a-Lot leaned toward Elias. It doesn't, it confided. But skeletal coughing fits can last decades if you're not careful. The ancient skeleton cleared its non-existent throat. As I was saying, Rule 1. Speakers must keep their anecdotes to under 5 centuries. This prompted immediate outcry. A particularly vocal skull shot up from the crowd. That's barely enough time to properly contextualize the agricultural reforms of Charlemagne, or describe the complete lineage of my third cousin's lapdog, added another skeleton mournfully. Elias, who was beginning to understand the true nature of his damnation, raised a trembling hand. Could we perhaps start with something shorter, like recent events? A hush fell over the assembly. The skeletons exchanged glances. The ancient one scratched its skull thoughtfully. Define recent. Last millennium? Elias ventured weakly. The tension broke as the skeletons burst into dry, rustling laughter. "Oh, that's precious," wheezed Sir Creaks-a-Lot, clutching its ribs. "He thinks 1,000 years is recent." The ancient skeleton composed itself first. "Very well. For our new friend's sake, we'll begin with Sister Brittle's account of the Great Leak Famine of 1124. A relatively brief affair. Only took her 70 years to tell it properly last time." A skeletal nun in remarkably good condition stepped forward, her finger bones clasped piously before her. She opened her jaw, took a dramatic pause that lasted just long enough for Elias to regret every life choice that led him here, and began. It was the 3rd week of Lent when Brother Thistlethwaite first noticed the leeks were looking peaked. As Sister Brittle droned on with frequent digressions into monastic kitchen politics and the spiritual significance of root vegetables, Elias felt a peculiar sensation creeping over him. His skin had stopped itching where it touched bone. His breathing had slowed to nearly nothing. Most disturbingly, parts of Sister Brittle's story were actually starting to make sense to him. The moss-covered skeleton from earlier sidled up beside him. "You're adapting faster than most," it whispered approvingly. "Usually there's at least one more screaming phase." Elias examined his hands, the skin now stretched tight and papery over clearly visible bones. "How long does the transformation take?" Mossy skeleton shrugged. "Depends how many stories you listen to. The more engaged you are, the faster it goes." It leaned closer. "My advice? Try to space them out. I dragged my feet through the Black Death Chronicles and managed to keep my nose for almost 3 extra centuries." Sister Brittle was now detailing the proper angle for leek planting to maximize divine favor. Several skeletons had begun taking notes. One had fallen asleep, standing up. Elias found himself unexpectedly fascinated by a tangent about medieval crop rotation systems. He raised a hand. Wouldn't the 3-field system have prevented the famine entirely? The effect was electric. Every skeleton in attendance gasped. Sister Brittle's jaw dropped open in shock. The ancient skeleton clutched its chest cavity as if having a heart attack it was several centuries too late for. Sir Creaks-a-Lot was the first to recover. Did he just ask a follow-up question?" It breathed. Voluntarily, the symposium descended into excited whispers. The ancient skeleton wiped away an imaginary tear. "They grow up so fast," it sniffed. Sister Brittle recovered first, launching back into her tale with renewed vigor. As my young colleague astutely observed, the three-field system would indeed have helped, but you must understand the political ramifications of leaving a field fallow during. As the explanation stretched into its second hour, with frequent interruptions from other skeletons eager to share their own agricultural insights, Elias made two disturbing realizations. First, he was no longer bored. Second, and far worse, he was starting to enjoy himself. The mossy skeleton nudged him. "You're getting that gleam in your eye socket," it noted approvingly. "Next thing you know, you'll be correcting people on 11th century leek varieties." Elias opened his mouth to protest, then hesitated. He did have some thoughts on medieval vegetable cultivation now that he considered it. And wasn't that the most terrifying thing of all? Sister Brittle was winding up her story with a dramatic account of the eventual leek harvest, and then, on the feast day of St. Allium, the first tender shoots emerged, when a commotion at the back of the chamber drew everyone's attention. A very small, very excited skeleton came barreling through the crowd, its tiny bones clicking like castanets. "You'll never guess what I found," it squeaked. The ancient skeleton sighed. "If it's another debate about whether dust is a seasoning—" No. The small skeleton jumped up and down. "There's a new traveler upstairs," she just whispered. "Is anyone down there?" Every head in the chamber turned slowly toward Elias. The ancient skeleton grinned. "Well now, it appears your probationary period may be ending sooner than expected." As the skeletons began excitedly discussing protocol for initiating new members, Elias found himself staring at his nearly skeletal hands. Then up at the ceiling where some poor unsuspecting soul stood exactly where he had stood, not so very long ago. The most horrifying part wasn't the realization that he was about to become the thing he feared. It was the tiny, undeniable spark of anticipation he felt at the thought of finally having someone new to talk to. Sir Creaks-a-Lot patted his shoulder. "Don't worry," it whispered. "The first corruption of an innocent soul is always the hardest." Elias looked down at his lap, where his fingers had begun unconsciously tapping out the rhythm of Sister Brittle's leek harvest ballad. Somewhere above them, a woman's voice called down again, slightly louder this time. "Hello?" The skeletons held their breath. Elias hesitated for just a moment. Then, with a voice that was barely his own anymore, he whispered back, "Welcome. We've been waiting for you." Chapter 9. The Art of Sleepless Nights. The moment Elias whispered his response to the unseen traveler above, a profound realization settled over him like the dust in the catacombs. He hadn't slept since arriving. Not truly slept. He'd closed his eyes during particularly tedious agricultural lectures, perhaps drifted into a sort of trance during the 14th retelling of the Great Leek Famine, but actual sleep? That ship had sailed long before his skin started resembling parchment. The ancient skeleton noticed his epiphany first. "Ah," it whispered, sounding almost apologetic. "You've figured out our little secret." Elias flexed his fingers, watching the thin membrane of his nearly translucent skin stretch over knuckles that were becoming more prominent by the hour. "There's no sleep here," he murmured. Not as a question, but as a dreadful certainty. Sir Creaks-a-Lot let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, there's sleep. Just not for listeners. The rules are quite clear on that point." As if to demonstrate, 3 skeletons in the back row abruptly slumped against each other, in what could only be described as a bony dial. One began snoring in a rhythmic pattern that suspiciously resembled the opening verses of Greensleeves. The moss-covered skeleton leaned in. "The trick is to become boring enough to put yourself to sleep. Took me 2 centuries to master it. Now I can doze through entire crusades." Above them, the newcomer's footsteps hesitated near the catacomb entrance. Elias felt a peculiar twinge, something between sympathy and anticipation. As the woman called down again, "Hello? Is someone there?" Every skeleton in the chamber froze in perfect stillness, 100 empty eye sockets fixed expectantly on Elias. The ancient skeleton extended its half-arm in a courtly gesture. "Would you like to do the honors?" Elias opened his mouth, then closed it. A terrible understanding dawned on him. This was the true horror of the catacombs, not the transformation, not the endless stories, but the realization that he wanted her to come down. Needed her to. The cruel mathematics of eternity demanded fresh listeners to share the burden of wakefulness. When he finally spoke, his whisper carried the weight of centuries. "We're down here," he called up, putting just the right amount of warmth into his voice. "You're not lost, are you?" The ancient skeleton nodded approvingly. "Nicely done. A touch of concern, a hint of camaraderie. You're a natural." As the woman above shifted uncertainly at the entrance, Elias found himself falling into the rhythm of the catacomb's oldest ritual. "It's quite safe," he continued, his voice the perfect blend of reassuring and curious. "Though I should warn you, there's the most fascinating moss growth down here. The patterns are unlike anything I've seen topside." Sir Creaks-a-Lot gave him a thumbs up. "Moss, classic opener. Gets them every time." The footsteps drew closer. A pebble skittered down the entrance ramp. Elias felt his jaw tighten in what might have been guilt or excitement, or some strange new emotion for which the living had no name. The ancient skeleton placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "The first recruitment is always the hardest," it whispered. "But think of it this way. Every new listener means you'll eventually get to sleep for a few centuries." Elias watched as a shaft of faint light from above outlined a hesitant silhouette at the entrance. He flexed his fingers again, noting how the joints moved more smoothly now, with less flesh to slow them down. "Would you like to hear about the time we debated whether lichen is a plant or a philosophy?" He called up to the newcomer, his voice already taking on the cadence of someone who had all the time in the world to wait for an answer. Somewhere deep in the catacombs, a skeleton began softly humming a lullaby from the 12th century. It was, Elias realized, the closest thing to sleep he would know for a very long time. And as the woman took her first step downward, he prepared to welcome her properly, with all the patience, politeness, and excruciating detail that eternity demanded. Chapter 10. The Bargain. The moment the woman's foot touched the first step descending into the catacombs, Elias Thornwood felt the last remnants of his humanity rebel. His bones ached with the memory of sunlight, of blinking against morning light rather than eternal darkness, of breathing air that didn't taste of dust and centuries. "Wait," he whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop it. Every skeleton in the chamber turned to stare, their hollow sockets conveying varying degrees of disapproval and amusement. The ancient skeleton sighed, a sound like sand trickling through an hourglass. "Oh dear, cold feet." Elias ignored the pun, if indeed it had been intended. He focused instead on the woman frozen halfway down the entrance ramp, her face still hidden in shadow. "I'll make you a deal," he said, his whisper gaining strength. "Let me go, and I'll—" He floundered for a moment, then grasped at the only currency that mattered here. "I'll listen to one more story." Voluntarily, with genuine interest. A murmur of astonishment rustled through the assembled dead. The moss-covered skeleton clutched at its chest. He wouldn't. Sir Creaks-a-Lot shook its head. He couldn't. The ancient skeleton stroked its jawbone thoughtfully. "Definine one story." Elias, sensing the first flicker of leverage he'd had since whispering his fateful hello, pressed on. "One complete tale start to finish. No interruptions. Then you let me leave." He hesitated, then added the fatal concession, "And I'll never tell anyone about this place." The skeletons exchanged glances. Somewhere in the back, a particularly frail specimen began hyperventilating despite lacking lungs. "A willing listener?" it wheezed. "That hasn't happened since Brother Thistlethwaite tried to convert us all in 1347, the ancient skeleton finished. It turned its empty gaze to Elias. "You understand what you're offering? True attention? Not just waiting for your turn to speak?" Elias nodded, his neck vertebrae popping alarmingly. The ancient skeleton extended its half arm. Then we have an accord. As their bony hands clasped, Elias felt something shift in the air, a subtle change in pressure, as though the catacombs themselves were holding their breath. The woman on the steps, forgotten by all, took this moment to flee, her footsteps echoing upward into blessed silence. "Now then," the ancient skeleton said, rubbing its hands together with a sound like dice rattling in a cup. "Who wants to tell our friend their story?" Every skeleton in the chamber surged forward. Elias suddenly understood the depth of his miscalculation. These creatures had spent centuries, millennia even, waiting for someone to truly listen. And now he'd promised not just any attention, but perfect attention to one of them. The debate that followed made the Great Leak Famine Symposium seem like a brief aside. "It should be me," insisted the child-sized skeleton. "My account of the siege of 1204 only takes 8 decades if I skip the genealogies." "Anandos," sniffed Sister Brittle. "My treatise on medieval herbology contains exactly 42 chapters, a nice round number." Sir Creaks-a-Lot pushed forward. "I can summarize the complete history of cobblestone patterns in..." Silence. The ancient skeleton's command stilled the room. It turned to Elias with what might have been sympathy. "The choice is yours, of course, but choose carefully. Some of us have been waiting a very long time." Elias looked around at the eager, empty faces. His gaze fell upon a skeleton he'd never noticed before. Small, tucked away in a corner, its bones a peculiar shade of blue. It hadn't joined the others in their rush forward. "That one," he said, pointing. The chamber erupted in outrage. "Brother mumbles. He hasn't spoken since the Renaissance. His story makes the complete tax codes of Byzantium seem thrilling." The ancient skeleton held up a hand for quiet. "The choice is made." It gestured to the blue-tinged skeleton. "Brother mumbles, the floor is yours." The small skeleton shuffled forward, its joints creaking with disuse. When it spoke, its voice was barely audible, each word emerging with glacial slowness. "Thank you for this honor. I shall begin with my earliest memory. So..." Elias leaned forward, determined to honor his bargain. "Which was the sensation of being born?" A collective groan rose from the skeletons. Several face-palmed. One muttered, "Here we go." "In the year of..." As Brother Mumbles settled into what promised to be the most comprehensive autobiography ever delivered at geological speeds, Elias Thornwood came to understand the true nature of his bargain. Freedom would come, yes. But first would come the story to end all stories. And as the first hour stretched into the first day, as his bones grew heavier and the world above more distant, he realized with dawning horror that the skeletons had known exactly what they were doing when they accepted his offer. Some bargains were worse than curses. Some stories never ended. And some listeners, no matter how determined, might find themselves transformed before the last syllable slipped free. Brother Mumbles took a breath that wasn't there, and continued. "My mother's eyes were color of..." Chapter 11. The Never-Ending Tale. Brother Mumbles' voice droned onward in a cadence that made glaciers seem hasty. "And texture of swaddling clothes had..." Elias Thornwood's left kneecap detached itself and hit the floor with a soft clink. He stared at it in mute horror, realizing two things simultaneously. First, that he could no longer feel pain, and second, that he wasn't entirely sure when he'd stopped feeling it. Around him, skeletons were settling into listening positions that suggested they expected to be there for geological epochs. Several had brought snacks, if one could call carefully arranged piles of dust and the occasional fossilized beetle a snack. Which reminds me of sheep raised nearby. Brother Mumbles continued, each word separated by pauses long enough for entire civilizations to rise and fall. Sir Creaksalot leaned over to Elias. "You chose poorly," it whispered without a trace of sympathy. Last time he told this story, continental drift became noticeable before he reached puberty. Elias tried to respond, but his jaw had locked in what he feared might be a permanent expression of polite interest. He could feel his skin hardening, the last thin layers of humanity desiccating under the weight of Brother Mumble's interminable narration. The ancient skeleton, sensing his distress, offered a comforting pat on the shoulder that dislodged Elias's right collarbone. "Look on the bright side," it whispered. "At this rate you'll be completely skeletal before he gets to the interesting parts." My wet nurse had mole shaped like the Iberian Peninsula. Somewhere in the back a skeleton collapsed into a pile of bones with a sigh of relief. "Blessed silence," it murmured before realizing its mistake. Brother Mumbles paused mid-syllable. Every skull in the chamber turned slowly toward the offender. The ancient skeleton shook its head gravely. "You know the rules. Any interruptions mean we start over from the beginning." A collective groan rose from the assembly. Elias, whose vocal cords had atrophied to the point of uselessness, could only stare in mute horror as Brother Mumbles drew a deep, unnecessary breath and began again. "I was born." As the words washed over him like a tide of molasses, Elias made a series of disturbing observations about his changing state. His remaining flesh had taken on the consistency of old parchment. His vision had developed the ability to see in perfect darkness. Most alarmingly, he was beginning to find Brother Mumble's description of 12th century infant swaddling techniques oddly compelling. The moss-covered skeleton nudged him. "Your eyes are changing," it noted, getting that nice hollow gleam. Elias tried to protest, but his tongue had fused to the roof of his mouth. The ancient skeleton nodded approvingly. "Ah, the silent phase. Always a milestone." Time became meaningless. Brother Mumbles plodded through his early childhood with the speed of continents colliding. Elias watched in detached fascination as his fingernails yellowed, hardened, and eventually fell off to join the detritus on the catacomb floor. The other skeletons came and went, some to nap, others to hold whispered conferences about whether Brother Mumbles would ever reach his point. Consensus, unlikely. A few simply wandering off to stare at walls until their turn came to speak again. Which brings us to my 5th birthday, Brother Mumbles continued, blissfully unaware of the existential crises unfolding around him. Sir Creaksalot returned from what might have been a decades-long absence, bearing what appeared to be a fossilized mushroom. "Refreshment?" it offered, proffering the crumbling fungus. Elias, now more bone than flesh, found himself accepting the offering out of sheer habit. As he nibbled on something that had last been edible during the Crusades, he realized with dawning horror that he was comfortable. The catacombs no longer felt damp or oppressive. Brother Mumble's voice had become a familiar background noise, like the ticking of a clock one stops noticing after years in the same room. The ancient skeleton noticed his realization. "It happens to all of us eventually," it whispered. One day you're dreading eternity, the next you're arguing about whether 14th century or 15th century dust tastes better. The cake had exactly Camons. Elias looked down at his hands, now nearly indistinguishable from those of his captors, and understood the true nature of his bargain. He'd traded his freedom for a story, yes, but more importantly he'd given them exactly what they wanted. Time. Time to wear him down. Time to make the catacombs feel like home. Time to forget there had ever been a world above. Brother Mumbles cleared his non-existent throat. Which reminds me of a story within the story. As the skeleton launched into a tangential anecdote about almond cultivation in medieval Provence, Elias Thornwood did something remarkable. He smiled. Not a human smile, not anymore, but the slow, creaking grin of someone who has finally understood the joke. Somewhere above them, the sun rose and set on a world that kept turning without them. But down in the whispering dark, time stretched endlessly onward, measured only in stories told and listeners transformed. And Brother Mumbles, blissfully unaware of his role in this eternal cycle, continued his tale at exactly the pace the catacombs demanded. The almonds were ranged a pattern. Chapter 12. The Traveler's Transformation. The moment Elias's last fingernail clattered to the stone floor, something fundamental shifted in the catacombs. The air, already still, seemed to hold its breath. The skeletons, normally restless listeners, sat in perfect stillness. Even Brother Mumbles paused in his relentless narration, his jaw hanging open in what might have been anticipation. Elias raised his hands. No longer hands, really, but collections of bones held together by memory and stubbornness, and watched as the final scraps of skin flaked away like ancient parchment. The transformation should have been terrifying. It should have hurt. Instead, he felt nothing but a quiet sense of inevitability, like a tree finally shedding its last autumn leaf. The ancient skeleton leaned forward, its hollow sockets gleaming. "How do you feel?" it whispered. Elias considered the question. His voice, when it came, was no longer his own, but the dry rustle of dead leaves across stone. "Light," he said. Then, after a pause that would have been thoughtful if he'd still had flesh to furrow, added, This sent the assembled skeletons into fits of rattling laughter. "He'll do just fine," Sir Creaksalot announced, clapping Elias on the back hard enough to dislodge a vertebra. Brother Mumbles cleared his non-existent throat. "Shall I continue my—" "No!" shouted half a dozen skeletons simultaneously. The ancient skeleton held up a placating hand. "Our friend has just completed his transformation. Surely we can grant him one small indulgence before returning to your no doubt fascinating tale." It turned to Elias. "Would you like to try the window?" Elias tilted his skull. Movement felt natural now, unencumbered by muscle or tendon. "Window?" Without explanation, the skeletons parted, revealing a section of the catacomb wall that Elias could have sworn hadn't been there before. As he approached, the stone seemed to shimmer, then became as transparent as fine glass. Through it, he saw the world above, sunlight dappling through trees, a bird soaring across a blue sky, the distant figure of the woman who had almost joined them now safely cresting a hill far from the catacomb entrance. Elias reached out, expecting his bones to meet resistance, but they passed through the stone as though it were mist. A rush of sensations flooded what remained of his mind, the warmth of sunlight, the scent of grass, the sound of wind through leaves, all distant yet unbearably vivid. Then, as quickly as it had come, the vision ended. The wall solidified once more. The skeletons watched him expectantly. "Well?" asked the moss-covered one. "What do you think?" Elias looked down at his skeletal frame, then back at the now solid wall. A curious realization settled over him. He missed the sunlight, yes, but not with the desperate ache of his early days in the catacombs. It was more like recalling a pleasant dream upon waking. Something beautiful, but no longer essential. "It's nice," he said at last. The skeletons erupted in approval. "He said nice about the window," crowed Sir Creaks-a-Lot. "Took me 3 centuries to manage that." The ancient skeleton nodded sagely, a clear sign of successful assimilation. It turned to Brother Mumbles. "You may continue your story now." As Brother Mumbles launched back into his narration with glacial enthusiasm, Elias found himself settling into a comfortable listening position without conscious thought. His bones arranged themselves just so against the stone floor. His fingers tapped along with the rhythm of the story. His mind, freed from the constraints of human exhaustion, found unexpected fascination in the precise number of stitches on Brother Mumbles' childhood blanket. Somewhere in the back of the chamber, a new sound joined Brother Mumbles' drone. A faint, dry clicking that Elias eventually realized was his own jaw, working in quiet appreciation. The ancient skeleton noticed and leaned close. "First vocalization?" it whispered. Elias nodded, surprised to find he wasn't embarrassed. "Excellent." The ancient skeleton settled back, its bones making contented little creaks. "Now you're truly one of us." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon. Seasons changed. Years passed. But down in the catacombs, time stretched endlessly before them, measured only in stories told and listeners transformed. And as Brother Mumbles plodded onward through his interminable tale, Elias, no longer Elias Thornwood the traveler, but simply Elias the listener, found himself waiting with genuine interest to hear what would happen next. The skeletons had been right all along. Eternity wasn't so bad once you got used to it. Chapter 13. The Intervention of a Rat. The rat had been watching from the shadows for what might have been days or decades. Time flowed differently in the catacombs, even for creatures with beating hearts. It was a particularly clever rat, with fur the color of old parchment and eyes that missed nothing. It had watched travelers come and go, mostly go in the skeletal sense, witnessed the endless storytelling sessions, and noted with rodent precision how the skeletons reacted to unexpected noises. As Brother Mumbles droned on about the stitching patterns of his childhood blanket, a subject that had already consumed 17 hours of narration, the rat saw its opportunity. It scurried along the edge of the chamber, its claws clicking against stone, until it reached a precariously stacked pile of skulls. With deliberate malice, it gave the bottom skull a sharp nudge. The resulting avalanche sounded like a hailstorm in a china shop. Skulls bounced and rolled across the floor, their empty eye sockets staring accusingly in all directions. Brother Mumbles froze mid-syllable. Every skeleton in the chamber turned toward the noise with expressions of outrage that required no flesh to convey. The ancient skeleton was the first to recover. "Who," it whispered with deadly calm, "dared interrupt?" The rat, perched atop what remained of the skull pyramid, stared back defiantly. Then it did something no living creature had done in the catacombs for centuries. It squeaked. Loudly. The effect was electric. Skeletons clutched at their ear holes, despite lacking eardrums. Several collapsed into disorganized piles of bones. Sir Creaks-a-Lot actually covered its mouth in shock. Elias, now more skeleton than man, found himself torn between horror and something dangerously close to hope. His new existence had been one of endless whispered stories, of time stretching like taffy in the sun. But this was different. This was noise. This was chaos. This was change. The rat, sensing its advantage, stood on its hind legs and squeaked again, longer this time, with dramatic vibrato. Brother Mumble's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before managing, "I was... The ancient skeleton held up a hand for silence. "This is unprecedented," it murmured. "A living creature breaking the sanctity of our storytelling." It turned its hollow gaze on the rat. "What do you want?" The rat, being a rat, did not answer. Instead, it scampered to another pile of bones and began pushing a femur toward the edge with its nose. "Stop that!" yelped a skeleton near the back. "That's my good leg." Chaos erupted. Skeletons lunged to protect their bones from the marauding rodent. Rumbles, forgotten in the commotion, stood with his mouth still open, his story hanging unfinished in the air. Elias watched as the rat darted between bony legs, toppling carefully arranged stacks of ribs, sending phalanges skittering across the floor. With each new crash, the skeletons grew more agitated, their usual composure shattered by this unexpected interruption to their routine. The ancient skeleton attempted to restore order. Everyone remained calm. "It's just one small." The rat chose that moment to leap onto the ancient skeleton's skull and begin vigorously scratching its ear with a hind leg. Elias did something then that he hadn't done since his transformation began. He laughed, a proper, rattling, skeletal laugh that echoed off the catacomb walls. The sound froze the room more effectively than any interruption. Every skull turned toward him, their expressions ranging from shock to dawning horror. "You..." Sir Creaks-a-Lot whispered. "You find this amusing?" Elias looked at the rat, now perched triumphantly atop the ancient skeleton's head. He looked at the scattered bones, the toppled artifacts, the utter ruin of their carefully maintained order. Then he looked inside himself and realized something remarkable. He still had a choice. The skeletons had taken his flesh, his voice, his time, but they hadn't taken his ability to decide what he found funny. "Yes," he said simply. The rat, as if in response, let out a particularly pungent squeak and knocked over a vase that had survived intact since the Roman Empire. In the stunned silence that followed, Elias took his first unshackled step toward freedom, not through force or bargaining, but by rediscovering the most human thing left to him, the ability to appreciate terrible comedy when he saw it. Chapter 14. The skeleton's distraction. The rat's final squeak hung in the air like a rebellion given form. Every skeletal face turned toward the noise, their hollow eye sockets widening in appalled fascination. For the first time in centuries, Brother Mumble's story lay forgotten mid-sentence, his jaw frozen around the word blanket like a broken clock. Elias felt the moment stretch taut between them all, the furious skeletons, the defiant rat, and himself, caught between two worlds. Then chaos erupted in a clattering storm of bones as the skeletons launched themselves at the rodent with surprising speed. "Get it? Don't let it near the ossuary. That's my femur. It's gnawing." The ancient skeleton stumbled forward, the rat still clinging to its skull like some demented crown. "Someone remove this creature," it hissed, flailing its half-arm wildly. "It's ruining the acoustics." Elias took an involuntary step backward as the skeletons surged past him, their usual dignified reserve, abandoned in their rodent-induced panic. His foot came down on something that crunched alarmingly, Brother Mumble's detached mandible lying forgotten on the stone floor. The storyteller skeleton was attempting to crawl after the others using only his arm bones, his jawless face somehow conveying profound betrayal. A path to the catacomb entrance yawned open before Elias, clear for the first time since his transformation. The rational part of his mind, the part that had spent months learning to appreciate the finer points of 12th century textile production, told him this was impossible. The skeletons would notice. The tunnels would shift. Some new horror would materialize to block his escape. The rat, now leading 3 skeletons on a merry chase across a pile of rib cages, let out another piercing squeal as it sent a cascade of vertebrae tumbling like dominoes. In that moment, Elias made his choice. He ran. Or rather, he attempted to run. His new skeletal body didn't move like his old flesh and blood one had. His stride was longer, lighter, his bones moving with a strange efficiency that sent him skittering across the stone floor like a stone skipped across water. Behind him, the commotion continued unabated, the crash of toppling artifacts, the dry rustle of furious skeletons, and above it all, the rat's triumphant squeaking. A hand clamped around his wrist bone. Elias turned to find Sir Creaksalot staring at him, its expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, to Elias's astonishment, the skeleton leaned close and whispered, "The 3rd corridor on the left. It leads upward." Before Elias could respond, Sir Creaksalot released him and turned back toward the chaos, shouting, "I think it went for the reliquary," with impressive conviction. Elias didn't wait to question his luck. He scrambled down the indicated passage, his bones clicking in a frantic rhythm as he navigated the twisting corridors. The sounds of pursuit never came. The catacombs, for once, remained mercifully still. When he finally saw moonlight filtering through an opening ahead, Elias slowed, his steps growing hesitant. The world above had continued without him. Seasons had changed. People had lived and died. The sun had risen and set over a landscape he barely remembered. What place was there for something like him in that world? A final distant squeak echoed up from the depths behind him, followed by an outraged chorus of skeletal whispers. Elias looked back at the darkness, then up at the stars just visible through the entrance. With one last rattling breath that was more habit than necessity, he climbed. The night air smelled of grass and distant rain. Somewhere, an owl called. Elias stood at the mouth of the catacombs, his bones silvered by moonlight, and discovered something remarkable. He still had choices. Behind him lay eternity in the whispering dark. Before him stretched a world that had forgotten him. And in his chest cavity, where his heart had once beaten, something new stirred, not hope exactly, but possibility. The rat, when it finally emerged sometime later with a stolen finger bone clutched triumphantly in its teeth, found Elias exactly where it had left him, caught between 2 worlds, but leaning distinctly toward the living. It squeaked once, questioningly. Elias looked down at his skeletal hands, then out at the moonlit landscape. Then he did what any sensible former captive of eternal storytellers would do. He followed the rat into the night. Chapter 15. The Final Sprint. Elias' bones carried him forward with a momentum that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with primal terror. Moonlight transformed the landscape into a patchwork of silver and shadow, each unfamiliar contour a potential threat. Every rustle of grass sounded like pursuing skeletons. Every snapped twig echoed like the creak of ancient joints. The rat kept pace beside him, its tiny claws kicking up puffs of dirt as it darted through the underbrush with practiced ease. Occasionally it would glance back, whiskers twitching, as if gauging whether Elias was worth the trouble. His footbones caught on an exposed root, sending him sprawling face first into a patch of ferns. The impact should have hurt, but his new form registered only the dull vibration of collision. As he pushed himself up, his fingers sank deep into the loamy earth, rick, damp, and overwhelmingly alive in a way the catacombs had never been. A sound froze him mid-movement. Not the expected clatter of bones, but something worse. Human voices drifting from the nearby road. "Tell you what I saw, clear as day," a man was saying. "Skeleton just up and walked out them catacombs. Bein' the cider again, have ye?" His companion chuckled. Elias remained perfectly still as the voices faded into the distance. The rat nibbled thoughtfully on his detached pinky finger before pushing it back toward him with its nose. Getting to his feet, Elias examined the horizon. Somewhere beyond these fields lay villages, roads, people who wouldn't understand what he'd become. The first light of dawn was creeping across the sky, painting the world in watery pastels that made his bleached bones stand out like a beacon. The rat squeaked impatiently and scurried toward a crumbling stone wall half consumed by ivy. It paused, looking back expectantly. Elias hesitated. His entire being yearned to put distance between himself and the catacombs. But the rational part of his mind, the part that had once calculated trade routes and negotiated with bandits, understood the immediate problem. Daylight would make him far too conspicuous. With one last glance toward the retreating voices, he followed the rat into the shelter of the wall. As he crouched in the mossy hollow between stones, an unexpected sensation washed over him. Exhaustion. Not the physical weariness of flesh, but the bone-deep fatigue of a mind that had endured too much. The rat curled into a tight ball against his tibia. Somewhere nearby, a lark began its morning song. Elias stared at his skeletal hands silhouetted against the growing light and made a decision. He would rest here today. When night fell, he would move again. And somehow, in this strange new existence between living and dead, he would find his place. The catacombs had changed him, but not completely. Not yet. As the sun rose fully, painting his bones golden, Elias did something remarkable. He closed his eye sockets and, for the first time since his transformation, slept. Not the trance-like state of the skeletons, but true sleep, filled with dreams of sunlight on skin and the weight of a body that had not yet turned to bone. The rat watched him for a moment, then yawned and tucked its nose under its tail. Outside their hiding place, the world carried on, unaware of the escaped listener sleeping beneath the wall, or the skeletons who would inevitably come searching when they noticed his absence. But that was a problem for the coming night. For now, there was only rest. Chapter 16. The Sunlight Salvation. The second night found Elias moving like a shadow between the hedgerows, his bleached bones wrapped in stolen burlap that smelled of turnips and damp. The rat, now his constant companion, scouted ahead, its nose twitching at every unfamiliar scent. Moonlight transformed the rolling farmland into a study of silver and indigo, each step carrying them further from the catacombs and closer to something Elias couldn't yet name. They reached the river as dawn's first light painted the water gold. Elias crouched at the bank, staring at his reflection, the hollow sockets, the lipless grin, the tattered remnants of his humanity. A fish broke the surface, sending ripples across his ghostly visage. The rat sneezed. Somewhere behind them, an owl gave a final hoot before retreating to its roost. Ahead lay the wooden bridge that marked the edge of the farming valley and the beginning of the forest road. Elias hesitated. Crossing would mean leaving behind the last place he'd been human. The rat nipped sharply at his ankle bone. All right, Elias whispered, then froze, horrified at himself. The sound was barely audible, but after everything, the habit felt like betrayal. The rat gave him an unimpressed look and scampered onto the bridge without hesitation. Elias followed, his footfalls silent on the weathered planks. Halfway across, a strange sensation made him pause. His bones, which had been growing lighter and more polished with each passing day, now hummed faintly in the morning light. He held up a hand and watched as the rising sun illuminated the intricate tracery of cracks and fissures that mapped his transformation. For the first time since his escape, he wondered if the skeletons could survive in daylight. If he could. The answer came as warmth spread through his bones. Not the burning pain he'd expected, but a gentle radiance that seeped into his very marrow. Where sunlight touched, the cracks in his bones began knitting together, the yellowed patches bleaching white as fresh snowfall. The rat, noticing his hesitation, chittered impatiently from the far bank. Elias took an experimental step forward. Then another. With each movement, his joints moved more smoothly, his stride lengthened, until he found himself running toward the tree line with a speed and grace his living body had never managed. He burst into the forest proper as the sun crested the horizon, shafts of light piercing the canopy to dance across his bones. No longer did he fear the day, he welcomed it. The catacombs had changed him, but not in the way the skeletons intended. Their curse had become something else under the sun's gaze. Beneath an ancient oak, Elias made his first vow as a creature of daylight, never again to whisper to skeletons or monks or anyone who looked too comfortable in the dark. The rat, sensing the solemnity of the moment, sat up on its hind legs and sneezed again. Somewhere far behind them, deep in the earth, the skeletons would be waking to find their newest listener gone. They would whisper amongst themselves, debating the best way to retrieve him, arguing over whose fault it had been. But Elias Thornwood was done listening. As the morning birds began their chorus, he turned his face toward the sun and walked on, his bones gleaming, his stride sure, the rat darting ahead to scout their path. The road stretched long before them, winding through places where sunlight fell unfiltered, and stories were told only by choice. And if his footsteps left no imprint in the dust, and if villagers sometimes glimpsed a pale figure moving through the edge of the forest at dusk, well, that was just another story, one he wouldn't be sticking around to hear. Chapter 17. The Lingering Echo. Deep in the catacombs, silence settled like dust after a long disturbance. The skeletons had finally stopped searching, their furious whispers fading one by one as they returned to their alcoves and niches. The rat's path of destruction remained, toppled bone piles, scattered relics, one particularly unfortunate femur with teeth marks still visible near the knuckle. The ancient skeleton sat slumped against the wall it had occupied for centuries, its half-arm resting across its knees. The others gave it a wide berth, recognizing the dangerous quiet radiating from their leader. Only Sir Creaksalot dared approach, settling beside its old companion with a creak of weary bones. "He's gone then," it whispered. The ancient skeleton didn't respond at first. Its hollow gaze remained fixed on the empty space where Elias had last sat, listening with what they'd all believed was growing acceptance. Finally it sighed, a sound like dead leaves skittering across stone. "They always are," it said. "Eventually." Sir Creaksalot picked up a fallen finger bone and turned it over in its hands. "The rat took one of mine," it observed without rancor. Somewhere in the darkness, Brother Mumbles had finally reassembled himself and was attempting to pick up his story where he'd left off. The blanket had a particularly finey. No one listened. The moss-covered skeleton shuffled over, trailing bits of lichen. "Do you think he'll tell others? About us?" The ancient skeleton considered this. Above them, through layers of earth and stone, the world continued its endless turning. Somewhere up there, Elias Thornwood was learning what it meant to be neither living nor dead, but something in between. "Let him," it said at last. Who would believe him? As if in answer, a faint breeze stirred the catacomb air. Or perhaps it wasn't a breeze at all, but the lingering echo of all the words spoken there, all the stories told and retold across centuries. The skeletons stilled, listening to whispers only they could hear. Sir Creaksalot tilted its skull. Someone's coming. Far above, at the catacomb entrance, a boot scuffed against stone. A voice, young, curious, and painfully naive, called down into the darkness. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The skeletons exchanged glances. The ancient skeleton slowly rose to its feet, its bones clicking into place with the sound of a key turning in a lock. It smoothed the front of its ribcage, adjusted a loose vertebra, and cleared its non-existent throat. Then it whispered back, just loud enough to carry, "Welcome. We've been waiting for you." And deep in the catacombs, the cycle began anew. Chapter 18. The Traveler's New Habit. Moonlight streamed through the attic window of the roadside inn, illuminating Elias Thornwood's skeletal hands as they moved across parchment with unnatural precision. The rat, now grown fat on stolen cheese and kitchen scraps, dozed in a nest of ink-stained rags, its whiskers twitching with each scritch-scratch of Elias's quill. Sleep had become an abstract concept since his transformation. While living men tossed and turned in the rooms below, Elias found his wakefulness a peculiar gift. The long nights stretched before him like blank pages, each one filled with the careful construction of warnings disguised as stories. On the dangers of whispering to skeletons, even well-mannered ones. Why one should never apologize to haunted statues. There's the perils of overly courteous ghost etiquette. The innkeeper's daughter, a sharp-eyed girl of 12, had taken to leaving mugs of oversteeped tea outside his door each evening. Tonight's offering cooled, untouched beside his writing desk, its surface reflecting the hollows of his face as he worked. He'd tried drinking once. The liquid had poured straight through his ribs and onto the floorboards, much to the rat's delight. A particularly loud snore from the room below shook dust from the rafters. Elias paused, his quill hovering above a fresh sheet. Somewhere beyond these walls, the catacombs still yawned deep beneath the earth, their whispering inhabitants no doubt regaling some new unfortunate with tales of turnip tariffs and medieval laundry techniques. The rat yawned, showing tiny yellow teeth. "Squeak," it remarked, which in rodent language roughly translated to, "You're brooding again." Elias set down his quill and flexed his fingers, the bones clicking softly. His stories wouldn't save the next curious traveler, any more than the old woman's charm had saved him. But perhaps, just perhaps, they might plant enough doubt to make someone think twice before whispering into the dark. He reached for another sheet, dipped his quill, and began anew. A cautionary tale regarding excessive politeness toward the supernatural. Somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour. The rat sighed and curled tighter into its nest. And Elias Thornwood, who had once been a man, and was now something else entirely, wrote on through the endless night, his words a silent vigil against the whispers that still sometimes echoed in his bones. The dawn would come eventually, but for now there were stories to tell. Chapter 19. The Rat's Reward. The scratching of Elias's quill paused as an unexpected sound reached his auditory canals. Not the usual rustle of the rat grooming itself, or gnawing on pilfered crusts, but the distinctive crinkle of parchment being nibbled with great deliberation. Elias turned to find his rodent companion perched atop a stack of finished manuscripts, its tiny paws holding down a particularly choice section on the improper use of good evening in haunted dwellings. The creature wasn't simply eating the paper. No, it was reading first, its beady eyes scanning each line before taking methodical bites at dramatic climaxes. "Those are warnings," Elias whispered, then immediately regretted the habit. The rat flicked an ear in his direction but didn't pause its feast. A closer inspection revealed the rat's preferences ran toward historical accounts rather than purely instructional material. It had nibbled perfect semicircles around tales of doomed courtesans and ill-advised duels, while leaving drear passages about proper salt placement for warding off spirits entirely untouched. Elias watched as the rodent reached a particularly gripping account of a baron who'd bowed to a vengeful suit of armor. The rat's whiskers quivered with excitement before it devoured the entire paragraph in one enthusiastic bite. The attic door creaked open, revealing the innkeeper's daughter holding a fresh mug of tea. Her eyes widened at the sight of the rat feasting on Elias's work, but instead of screaming, she set down the mug and crouched for a better look. "Smart rat," she observed. "That's the best part of the story." Elias' bones settled into what might have been a resigned slouch. Of course, the one creature in the county with literary taste had to be a rodent that had once saved him from eternal boredom. The girl reached into her apron pocket and produced a dried apricot, which she placed beside the gnawed manuscript. The rat sniffed it once, then deliberately pushed it aside in favor of continuing its meal. "Seems he likes stories better than food now," the girl said. Elias looked from the rat to his pile of writings, then to the girl who showed no fear at his skeletal appearance. A thought occurred to him. one that might explain why the catacomb skeletons had been so desperate for listeners. Perhaps stories, like curses, needed to be passed on to live. The rat reached the end of its chosen page and looked up expectantly. Without thinking, Elias dipped his quill and began writing anew. This time a tale about a clever rat who outwitted an army of bored skeletons. The rodent watched each stroke of ink with rapt attention, its nose twitching, its tail curling in anticipation. And when Elias finally set down the finished page, the rat fell upon it with the single-minded devotion of the truest literary critic, one who consumed stories in every sense of the word. Outside, the first birds of dawn began their chorus. Somewhere beneath the earth, skeletons whispered their endless tales to new listeners. And in a dusty attic, a bone-thin writer and his discerning rodent companion kept their own peculiar vigil against the coming light. The tea cooled untouched. The stories continued. And if the rat's droppings later contained particularly eloquent phrases, well, that was just the natural cycle of literature. Chapter 20. The Last Whisper. Decades had weathered Elias Thornwood's bones to a smooth ivory sheen. The rat, now gray-muzzled and slow, dozed in the hollow of his rib-cage as sunlight filtered through the cracks of an abandoned shepherd's hut. Time had carried them far from the catacombs, through villages that whispered of a spectral scribe who wandered the countryside, leaving cautionary tales nailed to tavern doors. But even cursed things could grow weary. Elias' fingers, reduced to little more than delicate twigs of bone, trembled as he unfolded the last parchment. His writings had grown sparse, his letters uneven. The stories had done their work, warning travelers, exposing cursed places, sparing at least a few souls from the fate he had endured. Yet now, as the final dusk settled over him, he felt the old whisper rising in his throat. The rat stirred, sniffing the air as if sensing the change. It crawled into the hollow of his palm, its tiny heart fluttering against his phalanges. Elias exhaled, though he no longer needed breath. The sound that escaped him was not a scream, not a plea, but the one word he had sworn never to utter again. The hut shuddered. Dust rained from the rafters. The rat, fur standing on end, scrambled to Elias's shoulder as the earth beneath them gave a slow, grinding sigh. Deep in forgotten places, in barrows and crypts, and yes, even the catacombs, bones twitched in recognition. Skulls tilted. Fingers curled. The whisper had been heard, and stories, old, patient, and hungry, stirred in answer. Elias's skeletal frame relaxed against the hut's wall. The rat, after a moment's hesitation, nestled back into the curve of his ribs. Outside, the wind carried the scent of damp soil and distant rain. Somewhere, a new traveler hesitated at the mouth of a dark place, debating whether to call into the shadows. And far beneath the earth, the whispers began again.